Hello everyone, welcome back. In the last section, we saw the usage of useState and useRef to maintain the component level state. We also had a small glimpse of the useEffect here, which is the basic most default version of the useEffect hook. We wanted to run this piece of code after each re-render. Whatever happens, whatever triggers the re-render, this hook does not care, it just runs after every re-render. In this section, we are going to look at the useEffect hook in detail. Let's create a separate component for this. So we have our component ready. useEffect is often compared to the lifecycle events of the class-based components. This one function does a lot of the lifecycle methods of the class-based components did. In my opinion, this is a brilliant example of how to create a reusable function which satisfies a lot of requirements. In this section, we are not going to discuss even about the comparisons of how useEffect compares with the lifecycle methods of the class-based components, because I would say we need a different mindset to understand these two concepts. If you are working in a company, in a project which uses legacy React code with class-based components, then you have to learn the various lifecycle methods the class-based components provide separately. So let's get started. Requirements. The first requirement is I need a piece of code to be run after each re-render. This is the default, as I said, this is the default version of useEffect, and also we have to be careful that this is the most costliest one, because whatever happens, whatever causes this re-render, this function is going to be run. So we have to be careful. If we actually have this use case, we must make sure that we don't have some very heavy actions going on here. Runs after each re-render. This is the use case number 1. So after each render, including the first render, as you can see, and I refresh, we get that message, runs after each re-render. Now let's quickly have some state and see if that triggers this useEffect. I'm going to just call this ex, and the initial state is going to be 0, and here we are going to have a button, or but let's just have the state and a button to update the state. Let's add a function here, update x. Here we're going to set the x value. This is a valid syntax, but this is much more robust. So when we refresh, it runs once for the first re-render, and when I change the state, every time when I change the state, this function runs this useEffect hook. And I want to actually look at the flow here, and let's also have a console log inside the JSX. In the very first re-render, as you can see, the execution starts, execution of this function starts, and it reads through the code, and it reaches this point, execution ends, and then immediately it jumps to the JSX part. It starts executing the JSX part, and it stops executing that, and then after everything it comes to the useEffect part. So that is the flow we have to be very clear about. So let's let these console logs be there, and let's move on. Second requirement is I need to run a piece of code only after the first re-render. So this is a very common scenario that imagine if you are dealing with some API data. Whenever this component mounts, first renders, we want to hit the API, we get the response back, and we don't want to do it every time when the component renders, right? So let's do the second requirement. So this is what we have, but one small change which brings this functionality is that, as you can see in the document, the useEffect gets two arguments. The first one is the callback, the function we are passing, and the second one is the dependency list, which is we can mention an array of dependencies. For example, we can just focus on this one state, or we can focus on a prop we are getting, or we can focus on multiple dependencies. Let's have a quick example. For example, we have y, and I'm keeping, oops, okay. um, let's look at this in the next requirement. Right now, if you are not specifying any dependencies at all, that's going to be run only at the first re-render. Let's see, runs only after the first re-render. So execution starts, ends, execution starts, ends, and our this function only runs only after first re-render runs, and then our another which runs on every update runs. And I'm changing the state. As you can see, this function did not run after that. So this is the syntax for that. Let's move on to the, okay, as for an example, I'm going to let's have a set interval. Maybe I have a timer here, and the interval state is going to be 0, and when the component mounts, I'm going to have a set interval. So in the set interval, I'm going to set the timer. I'm going to increment the timer, and I'm going to run that for every 1 second. So I initialize this timer in the very first render, and this piece of code won't run after that, and we don't want that to run because we set that once and we'll be good, right? So we have the timer. I'm going to just print that. Okay, so as you can see, the first render starts the set interval, and the subsequent renders, actually these renders are triggered by the timer. And this piece of code won't run after that, which is exactly what we needed. So we have our second type of maybe these are modifications of the useEffect. One is very default one which runs every time. The second one, we added this dependency, empty dependency list, which made this code run only in the first render. Let's see this third requirement. Let's refactor the comment. I need to run a piece of code. The first one is after each re-render. Second one is only after the first re-render. Third variety modification is only after certain state changes. So a good example is, imagine if this component is receiving a prop called username, or let's say file name. This is receiving a prop. Just imagine this interface as a React, this whole interface, this division as a React project, and this part is a parent component and this part is a child component. And when I select one of the file names, it passes that to this window component, the file name, and it renders the file, a different file, right? When I select this, it passes this file name to this child component, it go fetches this particular file and renders this file. So imagine that scenario here. Maybe we are having a file name prop here, and I won't and the parent can change the file name this prop anytime, right? There is this connection between the parent and child. The child should always be listening to the parent if the parent can change the prop at any time. So we need a hook to run to listen for this particular scenario. That's our third requirement. Only we are going to look for certain state changes. Runs after certain state changes. Okay, so I mean state here, but this is clearly a prop. There is a good analogy of state versus prop. That is a state is like your rough note. You can write anything you want. You can modify. This is we can do anything with this x and timer. This component. But a prop is like a book you borrowed from your friend. You cannot modify it. So a prop is read only. You cannot tear pages out of it. You cannot write anything on it. So if you are a good friend, so that's a good analogy to remember the differences. State or prop changes. So we are going to make use of the dependency list. So right now I'm not going to pass this file name, but I'm going to, for this example, so we are going completely theoretical. We are looking at the variations of useEffects. So we're going completely theoretical. Let's just have something called a dep, change dep. That's the button name, and whenever we click that button, it's going to set dep t, and I think t plus 2. And so this particular hook we have runs on separate only after a certain property. We are going to insert our dep state as a dependency list. So this is the third variety, runs only after certain state prop changes. Let's also print the dep here. Let's start from the beginning. Maybe let's stop the timer. Let's stop the timer for this example. So this is the first render. Execution starts, JSX execution finishes, and then runs only after. And these useEffects will be run in the order of how we have lexically in our code. This runs first, this runs second, this runs third, or so it happened. And I'm going to click the plus. You can see that only this state changed. This useEffect hook ran, and when I click the change depth, you can see two hooks runs. One is runs only after certain stage. This dependency list hook runs. This one runs every time. So when I click this, both the hooks runs. So this is the third type of usage of this useEffect hook. And there is one more requirement, that is cleanup. So we have this timer running. I uncommented it. We have this timer running, and we have to stop it when we unmount this component, right? So how to do that? For example, let's create a wrapper function which is going to render this function, and we're going to pass the wrapper to the parent. So now we have no big differences here. It still runs, and I'm going to have a state here, which is, we'll call that show, and it will be true by default. And I'm going to use conditional rendering here. Only if it's true, I'm going to display the example useEffect component. And I'm also going to have a button here, which on clicking I'm going to toggle that. So the idea is, when I click this, it's going to completely unmount this child component. And let's see what happens. Let's start from the beginning. So execution starts, all the hooks runs at the first time, and then now I'm going to toggle. So the child component, this whole component, we have unmounted that from our DOM. So React actually saved us here. As you can read, it says that we can perform a React state update on an unmounted component. We have unmounted that component, but still this hook, which we initiated when we mounted the DOM, we initiated this set interval, but we did not do anything to clean up this thing, this timer going on, right? So this is a very common use case too, when we are having a chat application, some subscription would have been running in the background, or it could be some socket connection established, and when we unmount, when the user navigates to some other page, or just when we unmount the component, we have to clean up that subscription or something like this, which is running continuously in the backend. So that is the fourth variant we are going to create using the useEffect. So as I said in the beginning, useEffect is a brilliant example of how to create a reusable function which solves a lot of problems. Let's see the fourth example. And fourth example we are going to include in this useEffect hook only. We are basically going to save the ID, the timer ID here. And this is a syntax the people behind useEffect came up with, that they ask us to return a function, and that should be a function, and whatever we return, they will run when this component unmounts. Here I'm going to use clear interval, and I'm going to pass the timer ID. So this is a syntactic sugar, or something, as I said, the people who created useEffect, they want to have one function with multiple usages, and they just ask a function to return, and if we return a function, they are going to run this when the component is unmounted. Okay, let's see this. Let's run from the beginning. So our timer is running, and the flow is working as expected. I can change this, I can change this, and things are happening, and I'm going to unmount this component. This could be where I navigate to some other component, some other route, etc. And let's see, and let's have a log here, component unmounted. Okay, so things are happening, and everything is working, and I'm going to now toggle this, unmount this component. See, the component unmounted. And when you look at the flow, it's very normal flow, and we explicitly may ask as we passed this clear interval method as it's a cleanup method actually. This runs, and this is a elegant way to actually clean up stuff, as I said, the subscription or a socket connection going in the backend. When I toggle this again, the component mounts again, runs only after first render. This guy mounts again from the very beginning. The number starts from the very beginning, and when we toggle that again, it unmounts elegantly. The takeaway from this section is, when you want to run a piece of code, after each re-render, just use this use effect and pass a function, and it's going to run. After whatever happens, it could be a prop change or state change, so this will run. The second variant, only after the first re-render, when you mount the component, when you want to run some setups, we can use this technique. Along with passing a function, also pass a empty dependency list. It's an empty array as a second argument. The third variant is only after certain state or prop changes, you can populate the empty list with a prop or state. So this use effect, this hook will run only when this thing changes. We can have any number of dependencies in the dependency list. And the final one is the cleanup. So whenever we have to clean up, here for example, we created a set interval, a timer, which keeps running, but when we unmount this component, we need to clean up, we need to actually clear the interval, so we use this. So this is just a syntax. When we return a function from inside the first argument, which is a function, this piece of code will be used for cleanup. We can just have a console log even, and if we can have this cleanup function into any of these use effects, any of these three use effect types we saw earlier. So that's all about use effects. See you in the next section. Thank you.